Step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. These are his words. Let's begin. Since the Treaty of Tilsit, renewed at Erfurt, several causes of discontent had arisen between France and Russia. Emperor Napoleon had seized the Hanseatic cities, including the Duchy of Oldenburg, which belonged to Emperor Alexander's brother-in-law. His troops occupied Prussia and all of Germany, and he insisted that Russia fully adhere to the continental system. Emperor Alexander refused to persist in a system that would ruin his empire's trade and demanded in return the evacuation of Prussia and the Hanseatic cities. War seemed inevitable. By the winter of 1812, both armies were advancing, one to defend Russian territory, the other to invade it. On the French side, unprecedented forces were assembled. 11 infantry corps, 4 heavy cavalry corps, and the Imperial Guard formed a total exceeding 500,000 men, supported by 1,200 artillery pieces. France, Italy, Germany, and Poland were recruited to form this colossal army. Austria and Prussia, unable to refuse, contributed contingents. Troops from Illyria, Dalmatia, and even Portuguese and Spanish battalions, astonished to find themselves at the far end of Europe, joined this campaign. Sweden remained neutral, and the recent peace with Turkey allowed the Russians to concentrate all their forces against this formidable invasion. While the various corps of the Grande Armée rapidly crossed Germany, Emperor Napoleon established himself in Dresden, summoning all the sovereigns of the Confederation of the Rhine, including the Austrian Emperor and the King of Prussia. He spent several days presiding over this assembly of kings, appearing to take pleasure in humbling them with the display of his power. At that time, I was a squadron leader and aide-de-camp to the Duke of Feltre, my father-in-law and Minister of War. I expressed my desire to participate in this campaign, and at his request, the Prince of Neuchâtel, Major General of the Grand Army, graciously took me on as an aide-de-camp. At the beginning of May, I travelled to Posen, where the headquarters was assembling. My route passed through Wesel, Magdeburg, and Berlin, which I found transformed into a military stronghold. To avoid interfering with troop movements while preserving the dignity of the King of Prussia, it had been decided that the king would retire to Potsdam with his guard, and Berlin would be commanded by a French general. This capital, like the rest of Prussia, was overwhelmed with military accommodations and requisitions of every kind. The hardships endured by inhabitants in regions crossed by our armies were well known, but they had never been so extreme as at that time. It was not enough that residents were obliged to feed their guests, as had become customary during our stay in Germany. Their livestock was seized, their horses and carts requisitioned, and often kept until replacements could be found. I frequently encountered peasants 50 leagues from their villages, driving a regiment's baggage, grateful merely to escape by abandoning their horses. At Posen, I found all the officers of the headquarters who had not accompanied the Emperor to Dresden, as well as several regiments of the Imperial Guard, troops from various army corps, artillery trains, and equipment of every kind. Never had such immense preparations been seen. The Emperor had gathered all the forces of Europe for this expedition, and everyone followed his example by bringing everything they could. Each officer had at least one vehicle, and generals had several. The number of servants and horses was staggering. Soon the headquarters moved to Thorn, and from there to Gumbinnen, passing through Osterode, Heilsberg and Gutstadt, places famous from the War of 1807. The Emperor joined us at Thorn and visited Danzig and Königsberg before arriving in Gumbinnen. It was in this city that the last hopes for peace were dashed. Monsieur de Narbonne returned from Vilna, reporting Emperor Alexander's rejection of the proposals he had been sent to deliver. During his farewell audience, Alexander stated that he was resolved to go to war, that he would fight with steadfastness, and that even if Moscow fell, he would not consider his cause lost. In that case, sire, replied Monsieur de Narbonne. "You will still remain the most powerful monarch in Asia." The declaration of war soon followed this final exchange. The two emperors each issued proclamations vastly different in tone. Napoleon proclaimed with prophetic grandeur, "Russia is swept by the hand of fate. Her destiny must be fulfilled." Meanwhile, Alexander told his army, "I am with you. God is against the aggressor." From Gumbinnen, the army entered Poland to move closer to the Niemen River. Upon crossing the border, we were struck by the stark contrast between the two countries and the sudden change in the habits of their inhabitants. Everything in Prussia reflects prosperity and civilization. The houses are well built, the fields are cultivated. In Poland, however, one encounters only the image of servitude and poverty, peasants reduced to ignorance, Jewish inhabitants living in deplorable filth, barely cultivated fields, and miserable huts as dirty as their occupants. The Russian army assembled at that time along the Niemen River was divided into two forces. The First Army, directly commanded by General Barclay de Tolly, the general-in-chief, defended the crossings near Kovno. The Second Army, commanded by Prince Bagration, defended Grodno. Together, they numbered 230,000 men. On the far left, 68,000 men under General Tormasov guarded Volhynia, while 34,000 men on the far right defended Courland. Altogether, Russia had 330,000 troops under arms, while France had approximately 400,000. In these circumstances, Emperor Napoleon quickly devised his plan. He resolved to force a crossing of the Niemen near Kovno and to advance rapidly into Lithuania to separate General Barclay from General Bagration. While directing the Second Corps toward Tilsit to attack Courland and positioning the 5th, 7th and 8th Corps at Novogrudok to confront Prince Bagration, he himself moved to the Niemen with the Imperial Guard, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th Corps and the first two cavalry corps. The banks of the Niemen were surveyed, and a crossing point was selected slightly above Kovno. The army assembled there on the night of June 23rd, and 3 bridges were constructed in an instant. At dawn, the 1st Corps had already crossed. It was followed by the 2nd and 3rd Corps, as well as the cavalry reserve. The Emperor's tents were set up on a hill overlooking the opposite bank. It was there that we gathered to witness this magnificent spectacle. General Barclay, with only one division in the area, was unable to prevent the crossing. Kovno was occupied without resistance, and the Emperor established his headquarters there. From Kovno, the various army corps advanced toward Vilna, forcing General Barclay to retreat before them. I was sent on several missions to the generals commanding our troops, and had the opportunity to admire the discipline of the regiments, their enthusiasm, and the precision and regularity of their movements. The Emperor joined the vanguard on the evening of June 27th, and the next morning, after light resistance, our troops entered Vilna, where they were greeted with cheers. The campaign had been underway for 5 days, and already the Emperor's plan had succeeded. The two Russian armies were separated. General Barclay retreated to the fortified camp at Drissa on the Dvina River, thereby leaving Lithuania exposed to protect the route to St. Petersburg. General Bagration abandoned the banks of the Niemen to attempt to rejoin Barclay, but our forces were already positioned between them. During the Emperor's stay in Vilna, the corps of the Grand Army spread out across Lithuania, pursuing the two Russian armies in all directions. The King of Naples, with the cavalry and the 2nd and 3rd Corps, followed Barclay's retreat toward Drissa. The 1st Corps, advancing on the Minsk road, cut off communications for Prince Bagration, who was closely pursued by the 5th, 7th and 8th Corps. The 4th and 6th Corps remained near Vilna, where the Imperial Guard formed the garrison. Each day brought success, and every officer sent on a mission returned with good news. However, the season was not in our favour. Intense heat was soon followed by torrential rains, and this sudden change in weather, combined with the difficulty of securing forage, caused significant losses among the army's horses. The poor weather further degraded the already primitive roads, often consisting only of long wooden planks laid across marshes. Food shortages began to be felt as the army relied on local resources. These resources, already limited, were even scarcer before the harvest. Soldiers began engaging in indiscipline and pillaging, though success seemed to justify everything. The emperor, meanwhile, sought to capitalize on the important conquest he had made so early in the campaign. Vilna's geographic location immediately captured his attention. The Vilia River, which flows through the city, is navigable to the Niemen, and the Niemen itself is navigable to the sea. This prompted the emperor to designate Vilna as the primary supply depot. Supplies prepared in Danzig and Königsberg were transported there, and fortifications were built to protect the city from sudden attacks. At the same time, Napoleon recognized the political importance of Lithuania's capital. No sooner had we taken Vilna than the Lithuanian nobility requested the restoration of the Kingdom of Poland. A diet assembled in Warsaw, with Napoleon's permission, proclaimed this restoration and sent a delegation to Vilna to request Lithuania's adhesion and solicit the emperor's protection. In a somewhat ambiguous response, Napoleon indicated that he would decide after events unfolded. However, he declared that he had guaranteed Austria's territorial integrity and that consequently Galicia would have to be excluded. This evasive reply did not discourage the Poles. Instead, it inflamed their zeal, and they threw themselves wholeheartedly into the hope of regaining independence. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw's resolution to restore the Kingdom of Poland was solemnly accepted by Lithuania. This ceremony took place in Vilna's cathedral, where the nobility had gathered. Men wore traditional Polish attire, and women adorned themselves with red and violet ribbons in the national colours. After a solemn mass, the act of adhesion was read and accepted with cheers. A Te Deum was sung, and immediately afterward the act of adhesion was delivered to the Duke of Bassano to present to the Emperor, who received it graciously. A civil government was quickly organised for Lithuania, and its first action was to order extensive conscription. Amid these preparations, assemblies, balls, and concerts followed one another without interruption. Witnessing these celebrations, it was difficult to believe we were in the capital of a land ravaged by two warring armies, whose inhabitants were reduced to misery and despair. Yet when Lithuanians remembered their plight, it was only to declare that no sacrifice was too great for Poles when it came to restoring their homeland. The Emperor's stay in Vilna gave us an opportunity to observe in detail the composition of the general staff. Near the Emperor were the Grand Marshal, the Grand Equerry, his aides-de-camp, his ordnance officers, the aides-de-camp of his aides-de-camp, and several secretaries for cabinet work. The Major General had 8 or 10 aides-de-camp and a sufficient number of officers to handle the immense workload required by such an army. The General Staff, composed of numerous officers of all ranks, was commanded by General Montyon. The administration, directed by Count Dumas, the Intendant General, was divided into several services. The administrative service proper, which included ordnance officers, inspectors for reviews, and commissaries of war, the medical service with doctors, surgeons, and pharmacists, the supply service in its various branches, and workers of all kinds. When the Prince of Neuchâtel reviewed the administration at Vilna, it seemed from afar like troops lined up in battle formation. Unfortunately, despite the zeal and talent of the Intendant General, this vast administration was almost useless at the start of the campaign and became detrimental by the end. Imagine all the components of this staff gathered in one place, along with the staggering number of servants, spare horses, and all manner of baggage it brought along. Such was the spectacle offered by the headquarters. Consequently, whenever a movement was made, the Emperor took with him only a small number of officers. The rest were sent ahead or followed behind. If the army bivouacked, only the Emperor and the Prince of Neuchâtel had tents. The generals and other officers camped like the rest of the army. The duties of the aides-de-camp under the Major General were not burdensome. Each day, 2 of us were on duty, one to carry orders, the other to receive dispatches, and mission officers. Our turn came around only every 4 or 5 days unless one of us was travelling, which was rare, as the staff officers were usually sent instead. The Prince of Neuchâtel treated us with a mix of kindness and brusqueness characteristic of his personality. Often he seemed to pay us no attention, but when needed, we could count on his full support. Throughout his long military career, he never neglected the advancement of any officer who served under him. His accommodations were always in the first house of the town, after the emperor's. As he stayed near the emperor, his quarters were used by his aides de camp. One of them, Mr. Pernet, managed all the household details with exemplary efficiency. The Prince of Neuchâtel himself, despite his numerous duties, found time to ensure everything was well maintained. He was attentive to the well-being of his aides de camp and often inquired about their needs. Amid war, it was a great comfort to have no concerns over such details, being housed and fed better than the rest of the army with no effort on our part. The officers at headquarters further enhanced our experience. Among those attached to the emperor or the generals of his household were Messrs. Fernand de Chabot, Eugène d'Astorg, de Castellane, de Mortemart, and de Talmont. The Prince of Neuchâtel's aides-de-camp included Messrs. de Girardin, de Flahault, Alfred de Noailles, Anatole de Montesquiou, Le Couteul, Adrien d'Astorg, and myself. At times, it felt like being back in Paris amidst this group. We rarely saw the Prince of Neuchâtel, as we were not directly involved in his work. He spent nearly all day in his office dispatching orders based on the Emperor's instructions. Never had anyone shown greater precision, more complete obedience, or absolute dedication. He often worked through the night to recover from the day's exertions, only to be woken to revise the previous day's work. At times, his reward was only unjust or overly severe reprimands. Yet nothing diminished his zeal. No physical strain or administrative work was beyond his capacity, nor could any trial exhaust his patience. While the Prince of Neuchâtel's position never gave him the opportunity to command large armies, he possessed, to an extraordinary degree, the physical and moral qualities required for his role beside an extraordinary leader, like the Emperor. In early July, Napoleon decided to advance his headquarters to follow the army's movement. Glubokoi, a small town 30 leagues from Vilna in the direction of Vitebsk, appeared to be the most suitable central point. From there, he could move equally toward Drysse's camp to the left, Minsk to the right, or forward along the operational line where the two Russian armies might still attempt to reunite. The 4th and 6th Corps, along with the Imperial Guard, successively departed from Vilna to follow this direction. The Emperor, intending to travel quickly, sent most of the staff officers ahead. The aides-de-camp of the Prince of Neuchâtel left Vilna on July 12th, and after 5 days of marching, we arrived in Glubokoi. The country we passed through was generally beautiful and well cultivated. However, the villages, like all in Poland, were miserable and had been ravaged by our troops. We encountered several regiments of the Young Guard, notably the regiment of flankers, composed of very young men. This regiment had departed from Saint-Denis, resting only 1 day at Mainz and 1 at Marienwerder on the Vistula. Even during their rest stops, the Emperor insisted on training exercises, as he had found them insufficiently trained. This regiment was among the first to be destroyed. Soldiers were already dying of exhaustion along the roads. Glubokoi, a small town built entirely of wood, was inhabited only by Jews. The surrounding forests and lakes gave it a bleak and desolate appearance, and memories of Vilna did little to make our stay there more enjoyable. The Emperor arrived on July 18th, adopting new plans in response to enemy movements. Prince Bagration, through rapid marches, had escaped the 5th and 8th Corps' pursuit and was beyond their reach. Displeased, the Emperor placed the entire right wing under the command of Prince Eckmühl and criticized the King of Westphalia, who, equally displeased, left the army. These adjustments caused delays, allowing Prince Bagration to cross the Berezina at Bobruisk on July 17th and march toward Mohilev to join General Barclay at Vitebsk. Prince Ekmul managed to reach Mohilev before him and attempted to block his path. Meanwhile, General Barclay, learning of these developments and realizing that Prince Bagration could not reach Drissa's camp, decided to meet him near Vitebsk. The fortified camp at Drissa, which had taken such effort to construct, was abandoned without a fight on July 18th, and the Russian army hurried to Vitebsk. General Wittgenstein remained near Polotsk, on the right bank of the Dvina, to defend the road to St. Petersburg. The 2nd and 6th Corps moved to Polotsk to confront him. The 3rd and 4th Corps, along with the cavalry and the guard, pursued the main Russian army toward Vitebsk. The headquarters left Glubokoi on July 22nd, arriving at Bezenkovisk on July 24th. Reports suggested a major battle would take place near Vitebsk. The regiments were filled with enthusiasm, and we shared their eagerness. On the morning of July 25th, the Prince of Neuchâtel ordered me to inspect the entire right flank of the army up to Mohilev, where I was to find Prince Ekmul. My instructions were to dispatch messengers immediately to inform the Emperor of any new developments I might learn. A Polish officer accompanied me to question the local inhabitants. The Emperor was particularly keen to know the situation between Prince Ekmul and Prince Bagration, as well as whether the 5th and 8th Corps were finally in a position to support him. I departed at the first sound of cannon fire, signalling the start of King Murat's attack. Mohilev lies about 140 kilometers from Babinovichi. The postal road is reached at Sieno, but all the horses had been requisitioned, forcing us to rely on ingenuity to continue our journey. My travel companion proved very helpful, guiding me to Polish estates where the landowners provided us with horses. The region was calm, and no one had any news to share. We reached Kochanov at night. General Grouchy commanded a cavalry corps stationed there, with the vanguard under General Kolber positioned at Orcha. In front of them stood a Russian corps defending the route to Smolensk. At dawn on the 26th, we arrived at Chiklo, a small and bustling Jewish town, and later in the morning at Mohilev, where the 1st Corps was stationed. I observed the order and discipline that always distinguished the troops under Prince Ekmul. He informed me that Prince Bagration, moving up the Dnieper from Staroy Baikal, had attacked him unsuccessfully on July 22nd and 23rd. Realizing he could not force the passage at Mohilev, Prince Bagration had crossed the Dnieper at Staroy Baikal and was retreating towards Smolensk. As for the 5th and 8th Corps, they were expected to arrive at Mohilev shortly. Once they did, Prince Ekmul planned to advance along the Dnieper toward Orcha to rejoin the rest of the army. Thus, Prince Bagration had evaded the efforts to encircle him, but his union with General Barclay under the walls of Vitebsk had become impossible. The 26th was a Sunday. After attending Mass, Prince Ekmul received the Archimandrite, instructing him to recognize Emperor Napoleon as his sovereign and to replace Emperor Alexander's name with Napoleon's in public prayers. The prince quoted the Gospel, saying one must render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, adding that Caesar meant whoever was the strongest. The Archimandrite promised to comply, but did so in a tone that suggested little approval. I departed that evening along the same route. The next day, as I approached the army, I learned that in the 3 days of my absence, 3 brilliant engagements had occurred. At Ostrono, the enemy had been pushed from position to position, retreating all the way to the walls of Vitebsk. I crossed the battlefields, still strewn with the aftermath of these combats, and arrived at headquarters on the evening of the 26th. There, I reported on my mission to the Emperor and the Prince of Neuchâtel. The army was positioned in battle formation facing the Russian army, separated by the stream of the Luchissa. The Emperor's tents were set up on a hill near the center. That evening, we shared stories of my mission and listened to accounts of the recent battles. I was pleased to learn that several aides-de-camp of the Prince of Neuchâtel had distinguished themselves and that the troops' excellent performance promised even greater successes in future engagements. A general battle was expected the next day, but at dawn it became clear that the enemy had retreated. General Barclay had received news that Prince Bagration, unable to force the bridge at Mohilev, had crossed the Dnieper downstream and was heading for Smolensk, the only point where he could reunite with Barclay. Not wanting to fight before this union, Barclay had decided to leave Vitebsk and march towards Smolensk. The Emperor entered Vitebsk and directed his troops to pursue the enemy. After 2 days, seeing that the Russian retreat towards Smolensk was firmly established, he decided to grant his army some rest. This decision was particularly well timed, as reports from detached corps brought favourable news. On the left flank, the 10th Corps had conquered Courland and was approaching Riga. The Duke of Reggio, leading the 2nd and 6th Corps, had defeated General Wittgenstein near Polotsk. Meanwhile, on the right flank, the 7th Corps and the Austrians, positioned between the Bug and the Naro rivers, were holding their ground effectively against General Tormasov. The corps of the Grande Armée were cantoned between the Dnieper and the Dvina. The 5th Corps was stationed on the far right at Mohilev, followed successively by the 8th, 1st, 3rd and 4th Corps, with the left flank at Veli above Vitebsk. The cavalry formed the vanguard, while the Imperial Guard and headquarters were positioned in Vitebsk. That concludes the 10th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.